Well, after this introduction, I will. Secretary, thank you so much. You touched my heart. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Secretary, for honoring us with your presence. Also, thank you, Director Reyes Gavilan, for hosting us in this wonderful auditorium and in a library which tonight becomes an embassy of ideas. A democratic forum from where we can project ourselves into the 21st century. We are so happy, as you said, Secretary, to be able to resume the tradition of the Night of Ideas as an in-person meeting, an annual event which, when French institutes and embassies all around the world invite their communities to debate, philosophize, perform, sing, or even dance through the night. I see to 2022 as a form of rebirth, when the viruses we will be talking about in the spring are mottos such as liberté, égalité, fraternité, e pluribus unum, the rule of law, or one person, one vote, and how we can contaminate each other with them, with these good ideas. Our times are indeed challenging ones, when democracies around the world are under threat, when the tragedy of war has returned to our European continent, something 3 generations since 1945 thought they would never see again. And as we emerge from a pandemic which has thoroughly tested our models of solidarity and the safety nets of our welfare systems, both at the domestic and at the international level, challenged our models of governance, but also upended our economies, there has never been a better moment to engage in an exploration of rebuilding together, the theme of tonight's 7th Night of Ideas. The 2022 Night of Ideas is part and parcel of the European Week organized by the delegation of the European Union, and I would like to thank my colleague, Stavros Lambrinidis. Ambassador Lambrinidis has kindly accepted to bring to our exchanges his Greek and European wisdom on democracy at a time when our demos is looking for answers. Tonight's conversation will also reflect the mission statement of Villa Albertine. Thank you, Secretary, for having mentioned it. An ambitious effort of our cultural services to facilitate transatlantic dialogue through residencies of artists, scholars, and policymakers, and to empower communities of ideas. Jeffrey Rosen, the president of the National Constitution Center, a dear friend of France and of the law, and a super pedagogue of democracy, had kindly accepted to moderate our exchanges, indeed. I heard that tonight he's in New York by his father's bedside, and our thoughts go to him and his family. So we are grateful to you, Laurent Dubois, the co-director of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia, for gracefully accepting to bring the spirit of Jeffersonian democracy to our exchanges. Laurent will take over soon and introduce the participants in the 3 panels: how democracies can come out stronger from the challenges they are facing. Number 2, our global institutions, our democratic selves, who governs? And number 3, finally, common goods, the 3 pillars of revitalization. I will not name all panelists individually, but still want to express my gratitude that such a distinguished group of scholars, public intellectuals, and policymakers accepted to join us tonight for what should be a feast, not just of words and ideas, but also a wide-ranging musical styles, as throughout the evening you will be free to circulate from music to ideas and back in this beautiful building. Many contributed to making the 2022 Washington edition of the Night of Ideas possible. Again, I cannot name them all. Enough to say that it was a work of friendship and shared values in a community, large and small, which is vibrant and aching for democratic solutions. However, it would be unfair to start our exchanges without expressing our warm thanks to David Quick and his team here at the library for finding solutions to every problem. And our gratitude from the bottom of my heart to the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation for their generous support. Thank you also to our friends, Peter and Judy. And now, without further ado, let us demonstrate that we can indeed rebuild together, that representative democracy is not an abstract concept, but a living idea which deserves love, however tough and nurturing, and even more importantly, that democratic empowerment should be joyful and boisterous. Que la fête commence. Thank you for your attention.
So now we'll start with Laurent Dubois, who is going to be in a dialogue with two friends of France, Caroline Friedrichsen and Sophia Rosenfeld. And again, que la fête commence. Thank you for your presence tonight.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome to all of you. We're looking forward to several hours of thinking through the present context of democracy and looking for sources of hope and kind of inspiration for as we navigate the challenges today. In this first panel, we'll be laying down sort of foundations for the evening, thinking a bit about the history that we can kind of use to nurture our engagement with the present. And we have two wonderful scholars here. Caroline Friedrichsen, who is professor at Georgetown Law and a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. She was on the Presidential Commission of the Supreme Court of the United States, and also president of the American Constitution Society, and the author of numerous books, including Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over, The Democracy Fix, and The AOC Way. Welcome tonight. And then Sophia Rosenfeld, who was a colleague at UVA, is now at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History, and the author of wonderful books on the history of revolution and democracy, including A Revolution in Language from 2001, Common Sense, A Political History from 2011, and Democracy and Truth, A Short History from 2018, all books I recommend highly. I told her that although we're going to be talking about the recent history of France, that recent history stretches back until at least the French Revolution, perhaps before. So I wanted to think with you both today about how to think about our moment historically, right? How to situate. I think we often have a sense that we're in a unique kind of crisis, and maybe that's true, but there's also ways in which we're probably experiencing things that societies have experienced in the past, that democratic societies have confronted. And really the idea today of talking is to think about what are the resources we can use to kind of move through this stronger. So I first wanted to ask both of you to just give us your take on, what are we experiencing now? Is this a uniquely precarious moment where democracy is under threat, maybe in new ways and in fundamentally new ways? Or do you see this as kind of a period of crisis that has similarities perhaps to prior periods? And I guess we can start there.
Well, great. Well, first of all, thank you, Laurent, for stepping in for Jeff, who we will sadly miss, but I know it'll be a wonderful evening with you. And thanks, everybody, for being here. It's really an honor to participate. It's a hard question. I would say yes to both aspects. It's both uniquely dangerous to democracy, and yes, there have been situations in the past that have been also dangerous to democracy. And we can think about them in so many ways. I think in perhaps what comes to my mind is the fact that we experienced a real blossoming of democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. After 1989, I think people believed that there was really a new moment for history. The end of history, it was called by Francis Fukuyama. Democracy had won. And perhaps we became a little bit complacent, but I think we were right to celebrate. So much had happened that had really changed the landscape of the world, and we saw so many more democracies, and not just in Eastern Europe, but in other parts of the world, really coming into being and blooming. And so I think it is, in part, a reflection of our disappointment and our fears about backsliding that color this moment. But of course, it is also a uniquely dangerous moment because the polarization that has infected so many of what we think of as the more established democracies, and like the United States and obviously France, which just had an election, which, well, the current president was reelected, certainly registered the highest support for a far right-wing candidate that, than Francis has seen in the modern era. Polarization that produced Brexit. Worries about what is happening in Europe generally with Hungary and Poland. The world, when we look at India, which is always described as the world's largest democracy, Venezuela, and we could go on, obviously. So it's a moment of existential anxiety. But I would like to say, you know, of course, we in the United States have had our many existential fears that have caused us to go. We've gone through so many episodes of where our democracy has been threatened, and our democracy is really a new and growing feature of America. So we have to remember that in this moment of existential anxiety that we're in, we are also a far better country than we were. Our democracy is stronger and bigger and encompasses more people. I mean, it was just 2 years ago we celebrated the 19th Amendment. We are now at the verge of what people would like to call or like to see as our fourth founding. Our first founding could be described as the adoption of the Constitution and Declaration. The second founding was the Reconstruction Amendments. The third founding being the Civil Rights Movement. And the fourth founding would be the reclaiming of our democracy and strengthening and building it. I think that's what we're here to talk about tonight.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say in some ways that we may have gotten kind of complacent, because I think that's a little bit true, that democracy, we got used to it in a certain way until it seemed like it could never go away. And I think I spent a lot more time thinking traditionally about how did democracies get started than how did they end? And it's kind of a newer question. But truth to tell, I think we'd probably all agree that looking back, people have often thought of democracy as a really hard kind of government to make work. It's not the easiest way to imagine how people can live together, because coercion is not supposed to be the central thing that holds people together. And democracies require a lot of things that are kind of unspoken, but certain kind of commitments that people have to share that are not really that obvious. One of them, I think, is a commitment to truth, that there is truth, that most people are telling the truth most of the time, that we know it when we see it, that truth is good for building things on. That has to sort of be there as a kind of unspoken almost assumption. Another, I think, is the idea that we have some kind of solidarity with each other, that we share something, and that's harder and harder to imagine, both because we've become a much more diverse and actually democratic society, but also because of wealth inequality that's been exacerbating that situation. And finally, I think we need to share some commitment to the idea that there are rules to the game, that, you know, elections work a certain way, for instance. You have to accept the winner or the loser, like it or not, because we've all agreed to the rules. And we don't really ever say all these things out loud that often. But they're one of the reasons that people in the past worried a lot whether democracies would ever really be effective. And I think what we're seeing right now is not just a bad moment in politics, but some of those underlying assumptions, in a sense, coming apart, not agreeing to the rules, not insisting that there is something called truth out there necessarily, not in seeing that we're share something, even a low-level something that would make us feel like some kind of community among strangers, among all our differences, but a sense that maybe the opposition is even evil or malintentioned. And that's what I think we're all in some ways responding to, the kind of the rug underneath democracy seeming not that secure as much as what happens at the policy level.
Thank you. Those are great opening thoughts. I wanted to pick up on this second question about what does hold us together, right? So part of the question is, and this has been a long debate, is it institutions and rules, right? Is it the rule of law that has to be enforced essentially by institutions? Or is there this kind of cultural matrix that would, a set of norms or a set of essentially cultural or educational matrix that allows people to participate. Both of those seem frayed at the moment, but I guess part of the question is, which of those do you think are most important perhaps in kind of rebuilding, and how do you rebuild those if they are frayed?
Well, I don't think we can really disaggregate them. I think we have to approach both of them at the same time. We have a lot of institution building to undertake, because clearly our elections are do not run well enough. We have had a lot of changes that have been made in different states that have made it harder to vote. There is the sort of the doubts that have been raised about the accuracy of the counts. And we do actually need to improve our election administration. We do have a lot of investment that we need to make, and there are a whole array of different reforms that people have talked about in terms of making elections safe and secure and accurate. We need to invest in all of that. I advocate taking a look at the Electoral College. It poses an enormous problem for our democracy when the popular vote among the American voters does not actually produce the American president. That is, I think, a great focus for doubt and dismay over democracy. So that we could talk about a whole variety of different institutional changes that could affect Congress and the presidency and so forth. But I think that other aspect that you talk about is equally important, but much more difficult to identify how to go about solving it. So when we have become so partisan and polarized that we draw apart, and as Sophie had said, in terms of even finding the opposition to be evil and malintentioned, as opposed to just disagreeing over ideas, it's hard to imagine that we can have a common civic culture. It used to be said that our Constitution was our civic religion, that Americans, what held us together was a set of ideas and a belief on we the people in order to form a more perfect union, and that we have changed it and adapted it and made it better over time. And that seems to be frayed as well. The radically different understandings of what the Constitution actually means for all of us. So I think that is a far larger challenge. But I see hopefulness, and I think the younger generations, which seem to have much greater openness to other communities, a much greater set of shared understandings about who they are as Americans. So I hope that succeeding generations will help repair that frayed fabric of American communal understanding. But I am still very worried about that.
Yeah, I think it's hard not to be worried, isn't it? I mean, I think probably everybody feels some kind of unease in this moment. Right, which doesn't have to mean that, civil war is around the corner or authoritarianism is around the corner. I mean, this might just be a period of stress. Or it might be that we are moving to some kind of hybrid where there are deeply democratic elements of our culture and some authoritarian elements of our culture, which won't be the first time that we've had those two. If you think of how democracy operated alongside Jim Crow or something in the past, you might say we've always had kind of blends of authoritarian and democratic strains in our culture. So it is hard to know. I mean, I can't predict exactly whether this is a cold civil war that will heat up into a hot one, or whether we're just having a kind of stressful moment. Certainly the pandemic has not helped. It's further frayed things in all sorts of ways, and all the trends that were there have in a sense been exacerbated by people sitting at home, lonely, cut off from other people, bored a little bit, too much time on the internet, afraid. I mean, those are all the things that have kind of driven us further. But I do think there are possibilities out there. The hard part, and we can talk about specifics in a moment, but the hard part, of course, is if we all agreed that we needed to strengthen democracy, that would work. The problem is that maybe half of people in the country don't see strengthening democracy as necessarily going to, reforming elections as where we should be going. And it's a catch-22 of sorts. To strengthen democracy, we need everybody to buy into democracy, but the whole reason we need to strengthen it is that people aren't buying into it as much. So that we do need to figure out new kinds of coalitions and new kinds of solidarities, and I do think democracy is a place to put stress, because it doesn't mean agreeing on ideas, it doesn't mean being the same in any sort of way, but it does mean potentially agreeing about the rules, agreeing about certain kinds of foundational truths, I think, and finding some sort of, I don't mean sympathy with other people, I mean real solidarity, some kind of shared sense that we're in this together, that your fate matters to me and vice versa, not just I feel bad for you as opposed to somebody else. And to approach that, I think we'd have to think on a very macro level about things like inequalities more broadly, and on a very small bore level too, which is ways we can, all kinds of things we might think of, how do we regulate the internet, for instance, very specific, or how do we regulate elections, that are much more specific things that we could do to bolster democracy. I just don't think those will work alone.
It does seem like also there's a kind of contradiction, and I'd love to get back to this idea of the fourth founding, but that we've seen over the past years incredible forms of engagement, whether the Black Lives Matter movement or moments, and I think youth really engaged around climate, and so it's not that there isn't a deep investment, but that kind of the connection between those kinds of movements and then real change, right, in the political structures. And I was struck when you're thinking, if we think about the fourth founding, right, all those prior moments were ones actually of quite violent periods of transformation, of real engagement, and of people essentially calling out a certain kind of injustice they saw, and then seeking out, right, a kind of expansion of democracy, essentially, maybe a truer democracy that kind of addressed the exclusions. And so I'd love it for us maybe to think a little bit about what that fourth founding would look like, and what forces need to coalesce in order to perhaps bring it about, whether they're institutional, whether they're movements. I know that's, this is really about envisioning the future, but what could produce a fourth founding that you think would move things forward in the way that needs to happen?
Well, that's a very hard question. The forces to produce the fourth founding, and then what does the fourth founding do? We could spend the rest of our lives talking about those topics, but I do want to just say, I think, I don't want to be too gloomy here, because as much as we can identify, and we all have gone through probably, moments of grief and horror in the past several years, yet we can also see, I would say, let's talk about Black Lives Matter, because I think there has been an enormous amount of an impact that sometimes doesn't register because it's localized very often. And there hasn't been a massive change at the federal level, perhaps. So we still have qualified immunity. We have use of force issues that haven't been fixed at the national level. But we need to look a little bit at what's going on in the state and local level. And I'm proud to say, I live in Maryland. There are probably some Marylanders in the room besides me. Maryland had the worst law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. Sounds like a great bill, but it was a terrible piece of legislation. It was passed in the early 70s, basically in response to the civil rights movement. And it granted impunity, in essence, to rogue police officers, which is not to say that was necessarily a large number of them, but it was enough, and they were granted impunity, and it caused a lot of problems. That legislation was adopted all over the country. Maryland just repealed that in the last year and is working to implement much, much better legislation. It's not perfect, right? It's hard to get these things right, and there are a lot of political forces on all sides of this question. But nonetheless, I think it's important to remember that these social movements and the Women's March, for example, actually have produced change, even though we don't necessarily see that registering in Congress right now. The other thing I want to say was that we've talked a lot about sort of election administration and the institution of elections. Well, one thing that did happen in 2020 was that the system worked. It was facing enormous challenges during the pandemic. And from the former guy who was contesting it even before the election happened, putting pressure on election administration officials. And there were some who caved. But there were many who held and ensured that the election actually went forward as the voters wanted it to. We face a lot of challenges in replicating that in the coming elections, but I think we need to be somewhat, to embrace that moment and figure out how to strengthen those norms, how to strengthen those rules. Again, I think getting back to your last question, it is this kind of the interplay between our civic values and shared understanding of what it is to be Americans and our institutions. And I think that is what is going to make our fourth founding.
Yeah, it is worth thinking about where change is coming from at any moment, right? So there's the possibility of change in the legislative sense, and there's the possibility also of social movements that produce change from the bottom up. I mean, one recent example is various unionization efforts. The one in Staten Island, for instance, at Amazon warehouse. That's really a bottom-up effort that's quite different and suggests the possibility of maybe an alliance around labor, across race, across region. That would be an appealing thing to see happen, for instance. Also, I think that we can look at this not just as a US problem. I mean, the circumstances are different, but not entirely all over the world. And recent changes, for instance, in the regulation of the internet in Europe have been promising, I think, to suggest ways we might begin to combat a conception of free speech that in American terms is often so unwieldy and suggests sort of anything goes with no rules to the game at all. And there might be real possibilities out there for instance, how to put together a strong protection for free speech, certainly, but with rules, or with rules of sort of civility, rules around hate, rules around truth that might go some way to changing the kind of political discourse that most of us feel we're sinking into these days. So I do think there are places to look, and it's important to think of hope in this, because I think the worst thing that could happen in a way is a retreat from politics. Because some people will say we're sort of over-politicized at the moment. Everything's political. You know, everything. If you put a mask on or you don't have a mask on, you're making a statement. That we've politicized everything, and that has its own dangers. But the opposite could be a problem as well, which would be to have people just sort of throw up their hands in dismay and say, "There's no hope. Everything's going down the tubes, and that's it." And so it's worth asking those questions about where laws have been successful, what small-scale movements, Black Lives Matter being a particularly visible one, but we probably don't all see its local manifestations, even though there's been so much pushback against it that, draws our attention.
I mean, part of the difficulty, right, is that there's lots of different time scales going on, and sometimes it's just hard to register what changes. Some changes are kind of tectonic. What have those who are growing up in this period? What are they going to bring to this conversation and so forth? And then there's always the immediate kind of crisis that seems. I'm going to open it up in a moment to questions, so I'll call on you first in a moment. But please, if you have other questions, please think about those. Just want to ask you, just briefly, you evoked this kind of question between the national and the international. And I'm wondering if you just have any thoughts on that. I mean, we'll take this up in the next panel, so this is also a bit of a transition. But what's the relationship between what happens nationally and globally, and how should we just kind of think about that right now?
I will say just this quickly, which is that one of the reasons I think we're so dismayed about the state of the world is that so many of the problems we face really can't be answered not just on a national level, a local level, but also even on a national level. Mm-hmm. I mean, our biggest problems today, climate change, a refugee crisis around the world, a potentially international war emerging in Eastern Europe, a pandemic,
right.
inequality. These are all, in a sense, too big to be tackled at the national level, and yet we live in nation states and vote on a national level. And unless we can start thinking about them outside of purely national frameworks, it seems to me we won't get very far on any of them. And I think some of the nihilism of today is driven by a sense, the planet's going to explode. What am I supposed to do about that
right.
kind of level of
Yeah.
politics?
Yeah.
Oh, and I was going to say, and it goes the other way too, which is unfortunately, ethno-nationalists, white supremacists, autocrats, oligarchs share with each other. I mean, it seems like an oxymoron that a nationalist would try and share ideas with another nationalist. But in fact, there was the whole Steve Bannon effort to try and create a kind of an international group of white nationalists and work with Hungarians and Marine Le Pen in France and the what's his name, Farrago in Britain and all of them to try and provide some kind of unified front for nationalists in service of white supremacy and racism. So you could see these ideas kind of get shared for those who are either autocrats or budding autocrats, autocratic wannabes. And they share strategies and tactics about how to manipulate constitutional systems and electoral processes, how to change courts and the role of prosecutors and so forth. And we can see this being manifested around the world. So I think the international dimension is both, we need to solve the big problems internationally, but we also need to recognize that these problems that are in individual countries propagate themselves from country to country.
Everyone has fake news now.
Well, thank you. Yes, why don't we start with your question then?
If you'll allow me to take off my mask briefly. The panel was very interesting, the fourth founding and all of this, but something you didn't touch on is why liberal democracy is currently in retreat and in disarray. And I think liberal democracy is not a religion. The reason it spread so effectively from Britain and the US, first Western Europe and globally, was that it was better than any of the other competing systems to confer betterment of people's lives. And so when we got to Francis Fukuyama in 92, essentially it was the system that was best at improving people's lives. I would argue that one of the biggest problems we have globally, but in this country as well, is that since about the mid-2000s, the system has broken down. The betterment machine has broken down. Massive increase in inequality. A fiscal system that hasn't responded, but essentially because the democratic institutions are in play to money thanks to Citizens United and other legislation, it means that lobbying can prevent the correction of this huge distortion, which is essentially being corrected through very loose monetary policy and increase in debt. So if the middle class are not feeling that their lives are improving, and in the meantime we've got China that has taken more people out of poverty in the last 25 years than in recorded history. And that is an autocratic system. So when you compare the two, there's not a lot going out there to say maybe we should keep liberal democracy. And until we fix our democracy here by improved fiscal systems, and by removing the play of money in the system, it's going to be very difficult to argue that it's a system that makes sense for the average person.
Thank you.
I have no disagreements with what you have to say. So I don't know to add anything at all.
There's a very interesting book of just a few years ago, it seems sort of prescient now, by Mishra called The Age of Anger. Maybe some of you have seen this. And it makes quite the point you do, but it points out that the combination of kind of liberal democracy and capitalism, hand in hand, which was held up as a sort of ideal in the late 20th century, has worked very well for some people in the world, and overly well for some, you might say. But it's left a lot of people behind, and it promised something it couldn't deliver to everyone, that globalization, this combination, has created a kind of groundswell of anger within both developing nations and developed ones, but among people particularly who feel that the promise hasn't delivered for them economically and culturally, that it hasn't respected their values, it's imposed something else. And it's a kind of politics of resentment, as much as anything, has emerged that's fueled a kind of populism, a pushback that sometimes doesn't even have new policy ideas attached to it. It's just a kind of response to the kinds of things you're talking about.
Brexit.
Brexit would be a textbook example. And I think you're absolutely right that it's not purely an economic problem, because culture is attached to class and things too, but we can't shove aside the degree to which this is an economic question as well.
Yes. How about in the back first, and then we'll go to you. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. And I want to add to that to mention the demographic shift in the population. So the world is becoming increasingly browner. And so as a result, this is definitely tied to cultural kinds of misappropriation that has been unaddressed. So it's going to have to be addressed. It's been simmering and mixing with the economics and democracy. It's been clearly unfair. It was going to swell up to this point. So the edema of this imbalanced economic and racially polarized world is going to have to address that at some point, which is not happening. And so even repatriation of the art that France has refused to give back to African nations that have asked for these things. So that might seem minor, but it also has a great level of weight to it. So there are some things that can be done, both nationally or hemispherically, that need to be done in various elements. Lonnie Bunch is considering various repatriation rights from the Smithsonian to Native Americans. So this should be conversation and actual action.
I think your point is very well taken. I would just say I think some of the extreme white supremacy that we see now it's been simmering. Obviously, it's been there, but it has been really unleashed by this sort of the so-called progressive forces forgetting about how to help the working class and how to fight for redistribution of wealth in a way that will help people come together. Right? It's an easy way to blame, right? It provides a blame, and right-wing politicians don't need to offer necessarily an economic solution. They just say, oh, the reason things are so bad, and for the Gilets jaunes in France and other places, in Brexit you blame the Poles, in France you blame the immigrants, and so there's always somebody else who's at fault. The right-wing politicians don't need to solve the economic problems, but part of it is because there's a loss of faith in those center and left parties because they stopped trying in a very concerted way to be the kind of, provide the economic populism. And so now all we have left is the kind of cultural populism of the right.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think sort of adding on to that conversation about white supremacy and the resentments that people are having towards their democracies and things like that, you spoke about the need or perhaps a possible solution for people to turn to democracy as something that is uniting them and is something that they can find common ground on and something to believe in. But I think that especially with situations such as the BLM protest where it was people putting their lives on the line to really create change, and then what little change did happen feels like the system failing them, not them making a little bit of, them taking a little bit of ground. And then you sort of see once every 2 years or year another major blow to like that belief in the system. So for example, what's going on in the Supreme Court right now. And so I wonder if you could just sort of speak to that about navigating wanting to believe in a system that does not pay attention to you.
I mean, I'll just say this. I mean, change can happen at a lot of different levels, and it's easy to get disheartened. You bring up the Supreme Court, for instance, but you can make a big difference at the local level, even when you can feel that your vote is sort of goes out into the wind in some ways. I think thinking locally and even at the state level is sometimes very important, and I think we all tend a little too much these days to think, and I know I said that we need to think nationally, but I'm talking about political action at this national level because we have such a dearth of local news, and because all our issues have become so nationalized that even every political race seems like it's a referendum on the whole country. But if you really want to make a difference, I don't think sort of just feeling frustrated every 2 years is the way to go. It's to start thinking about how to get involved in the places you can make change.
I was just going to add one little thing to that, which is, okay, obviously I've outed myself as a kind of lefty academic, but you're not surprised, right? But I would just say one of the things we do have to learn, I think, from the right is that you do have to focus on the local. And they have been very assiduously building capacity in local, very localized school boards. For example, I think you all remember what's happened with the school boards. So I think it's important to remember that takes a long time. It's frustrating because immediate results are not present, but they have long-term lasting results. And I think for us, those who believe in a democracy and a democratic system, we have to do that hard work of the slow building of the capacity at the local and at the state and then at the national level.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Go ahead, sir.
It seems you can't talk about any of this without talking about the power of propaganda, which in America has been so unrelenting and really unchallenged by the left from 1990, Rush Limbaugh, and his host of clone, dumping this just incredible load of hatred and lies constantly on the radio. And if you drive across country, that's all you're going to get. And then from 2000 or so, Fox News, which managed to impeach Clinton. We've had now two presidents that weren't elected, and I think actually lost both of them lost the electoral college. 12 years in the last 20 years, where this propaganda had a huge force. And you see what's happening in Russia. Most of these people, most Russians now, I was a reporter there for actually 15 years in Russia and Ukraine. Most people believe Putin, that they have to do this and they're Nazis in Ukraine. And what it's created is now 50, 60 million people that believe Biden lost the election, which is insane. And they only believe it because the greatest liar in the history of man tells them so. And he's coming back. Musk, the richest man in the world, is going to allow Trump to come back, maybe to help him become president again, because of course he's not going to regulate Musk, which is utterly terrifying. And I don't know how they're with our Bill of Rights and whatever, and basically the utter reluctance of the left to do anything to control it, how it's going to stop, because you allow these crazy lies to propagate, and now QAnon people are in Congress, and QAnon people are everywhere. You see the effect of some of their obsessions on Fox News. If we don't tell the whole thing of democracy is a shared idea, and one of the most sacrosanct is that the guy who gets the most votes wins. Now
Yeah.
Trump has thrown
So-
into complete challenge, and I
Yeah.
cry at night going to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Well,
Respond.
everybody liked that. So yes, I mean, the big lie, as it's sometimes called, that the election was stolen when we have full evidence that it was not, in some ways encapsulates, as you're saying, all the trends of this moment. It's kind of the perfect symbol for what we're talking about. And there are some particularly American preconditions for this. As you point out, the deregulation of news in the 1980s, which led to the creation of Fox News, the development of social media around 2005, you get YouTube and Twitter and Facebook all in a row with very different kinds of regulation of speech than traditional media have employed. Those are definitely catalysts. That said, though, the US is not the only place that's experiencing resurgence of the right. Since we're talking about France, about a third of the French electorate supports candidates on the far right of the spectrum, Marine Le Pen, but farther right too, Zemmour, etc. And there's no Fox News in France. I mean, there's not exactly. I mean, there's, okay, you think there's Fox News?
It's Fox Newsy.
Newsy, Fox Newsy.
Eric Zemmour came out of that.
Comes out of
Yeah.
is kind of the Rush Limbaugh
Yeah.
effect for sure. But you don't have quite the same sort of turn away from the breakdown of cable and the sort of the story that's often told about the U.S. But certainly you're right that there's a kind of publicity-seeking public persona, and there are variants of this all over the world. So I do think that much as one needs to talk about the economic structures, the media landscape, that it's not the technology itself, it's the way the technology has been harnessed, the legal supports and the economic supports to that technology have played a huge role in producing the particularly distinctive kind of crisis of democracy we're having now. There have been other kinds of crises of democracy, but not this particular one. So yes, we need to address that too.
Yep. Well, thank you both. We unfortunately have to end this conversation, but the conversation continues at... So we'll just reconvene in a few minutes, about 7:20, to talk about global institutions. Stay here.
If I may, this is extremely un-French. We're on time. So we will continue our conversation with two ambassadors and an ex-secretary in the French cabinet. It's an immense pleasure to welcome Ramayad, Ambassador Holliday and Ambassador Lambridinis to this conversation, which is going to take a global turn, but then we have already articulated the global and the local. So, Laurent.
Well, thank you all for continuing the conversation, and thank you all for joining us. We have a really remarkably distinguished group here on stage of people who've been engaged in international organizations and international relations and the global questions. And so we're going to talk about the present and maybe the future of these global institutions in a moment of crisis and change. I will give, again, brief introductions. Each has a remarkable bio. Ramayad, to my left here, is director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and senior fellow at the Europe Center. She was consultant for the World Bank and has worked on questions of sport and human capital in Africa, and has a long experience in the public service in France, as well as in international organizations. She was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Human Rights of the Republic of France, and the first ever French Minister for Human Rights, and the first woman of African descent to become a member of the French cabinet. To her left is Ambassador Stuart Holliday, who's the CEO of Meridian International Center, a nonpartisan institution that looks at global security and prosperity. He was the United States Ambassador for Special Political Affairs at the United Nations from 2003 to 2005, among other important roles in the international stage. And finally, to my right, we have Stavros Lambrinidis, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, and he also served the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, again, as well as many other roles in the Greek Democratic Party, European Parliament, and elsewhere in Europe. So thank you all for joining us. We look forward to the conversation. I suppose we already started this conversation a little bit, which is to think through some of the tensions between the fact that democracies operate in some ways at a national level, and yet our problems are fundamentally global at this point, and all democracies face issues that cannot really be solved or addressed only locally. And so obviously the international organizations, many of which born after World War II, some earlier, that we depend on to think internationally, are central, and yet I think there is a sense of a crisis of those institutions and their ability to confront a situation like Ukraine or others. So I want to ask you both, all three of you, to start by thinking about how would you describe the current state of these international organizations? You know, are you optimistic, pessimistic? What are these international organizations? Where are they now? And then we'll talk a little bit about where they might go in the future. So maybe I'll start with you, Stuart.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and welcome to the Secretary of State of the District of Columbia. You know, I had the experience of serving as ambassador at the Security Council, which kind of encapsulates both the promise and the limitations of the UN and sort of America's view of international. I guess I'm doing the American thing, which at the UN was interesting because frequently we were both the leader on many issues, but also the target as well. But you know, the United States was, under President Wilson, was behind the founding of the League of Nations, which blew up, of course, when domestic and congressional opposition prevented it from happening. And out of the wake of the Second World War, as you mentioned, there was the San Francisco Conference and the promise of a charter, which actually, if you read the UN Charter today, you probably wouldn't change a word. And I know when I was at the UN in the mid-2000s, everybody wanted to wordsmith the charter that that's the problem. But really, the United Nations, what I think the US sometimes fails to recognize is it's really almost like a board of directors. It's not an abstract opposing institution, it's you. And it's how much you put into it and how much you lead and how much you have confidence in. And the challenge in the United States is our Congress has a very particular view of its control of the purse strings. So frequently the United States is the only country where we have to go back and ask for permission as it relates to fiscal issues and commitments to peacekeeping and so forth. But where I would see the moment now is it's a mixed bag. So I see hope in that Ambassador Thomas Greenfield at the UN has put forth, I think, a very forceful vision of values that are currently under attack around the world, and therefore the forum is being used. But we also see the continued gridlock of the veto system and the fact that Russia has a veto on Security Council action. I was interested to see a proposal by a very small country, but one that punches above its weight, Liechtenstein, if a member state of the Perm 5 vetoes a resolution, that would automatically force a debate in the General Assembly. But what you talked about in your first panel, in short, is sort of a microcosm of what's happening in faith in international institutions. Are governments properly elected that have a vote? Do countries respect human rights, the rights of women? What is the actual practical ability of the UN to ensure peace and security? So more on that later, but I think it's an opportunity where we see a coalescing, particularly around opposition to what's happening in the Ukraine, but also the fact that there were so many abstentions to the intervention in the Ukraine by countries that are part of the G20, countries that are part of the family of, you know, nations that are supposed to share democratic values, shows that there's not full trust in this idea of a black and white view that can be expressed by one country that defines the situation, and therefore it requires ongoing diplomacy, the gardening of diplomacy every day. So I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, the minister and my good friend, the ambassador.
Thank you. Hama?
Yes, thank you very much, Laurent. It's an important honor for me to the... Oh, sorry. Does it work? Yes, okay. I was saying, hello everybody, it's an important honor for me to answer to the Villa Albertine's call to participate in this night of ideas with the Institut Français. About this important topic, where are we going? That was the roof under which we are talking. And the role of the international organizations in the rebuilding of institutions and democratic institutions. A few days ago at the Atlantic Council, the U.S. think tank in which I'm working, we hosted Secretary Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary Yellen, and she mentioned the necessity to reform those international organizations, including the Bretton Woods system, saying that, I mean IMF and World Bank, that we cannot continue like this because this system does not match with these times, the new geopolitical order that is emerging under our nose. And we don't have the words to specify or to explain what's going on. But between the economic consequences of the worst pandemic that changed a lot of things, and this war in Ukraine, the consequences on the energy sector, but also the emergence of China as a global power, of Russia too, and like you said, the UN votes, a lot is happening. And from Paris, you know, sometimes I can speak from Paris, and sometimes I speak from Dakar, and sometimes I speak from Washington. It's not so easy, it's so obvious, but from Dakar, let's say from Dakar. Just an example about this Russia war. Russia is not so isolated. I mean, 60% of the world's population did not condemn the invasion of Ukraine, including the largest democracy of the world, I mean India, including Washington and Paris friends like Morocco or Senegal, which means that something is going on here, and it's not new, because since a few years now, from those capitals, we can hear that an alternative multilateralism is emerging. And they have their own World Bank, their own IMF, their own system. So how can we avoid a bipolar system? How can we avoid this situation, not only by criticizing Russians, but I think it's important to renew the policy to what we call now the Global South. And to renew it, Secretary Yellen's statement I was mentioning earlier is important. We need to rebuild this multilateral system inherited from 1945, and that does not take into consideration the new stakes, the new powers, the new needs. Africa, for example, is the oldest continent, the youngest continent, and soon the largest population. They represent almost 30% of votes at the UN, but no voice. Let's take the example of climate. African nations are not responsible for climate change, only 4% or less than 4% of gas emissions, but they suffer the most from the global warming without any voice to promote solutions, and that's a problem. How can we handle the problem of migrations without any solutions coming from the African continent? It's also the place where of the fastest growing economies in the world, the home of the green technologies, the place where the biggest digital revolution in the world took place during these last 2 decades. It's a lot for a continent that does not matter anywhere in the international organizations. So when we arrive then and say, okay, now vote with us to condemn Russia, as in the meantime, Wagner is on the continent growing its influence. a few of them can say, okay, we have many reasons not to vote with you. Good or bad, but you know, the history, for example, after all, Russians, they were with us when we tried to find our independence, our freedom. And two, Wagner is not so far from our borders, and we can be scared about, you know, of the retaliations they could cause to our populations. So it can be less or more convenient, I don't know, but they have various reasons to say, to do what they did, which does not justify anything, because in the same time, they can totally understand, given their history, that one country cannot invade another country like this. It's not normal. So given that situation, I think it's the right time for Secretary Yellen to break the taboo, because it was a taboo since like 5 decades, and say now maybe it's time to rebuild the geopolitical order.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you for having me as well, and I think fantastic interventions. I would say quickly 3 things on your question. The first one is that international institutions were built, most of them after the Second World War, on a fundamental premise that we have to move away from the right of might, because we had seen what that could do and the devastation it could bring, and towards a world that respects human dignity, does not consider any life dispensable, and therefore builds our cooperation on the basis of human rights and open democratic societies, more or less. Now, yes, there is a concerted attack against that system by countries that are ideologically or politically committed against human rights or democracy. But, and I'll just throw this out and I'll leave it there, it's food for thought, I think that what has happened in the past few years, including, unfortunately, from the interventions of the biggest democracy in the world, the United States, in the international system, has also been quite problematic. The consistent attack against the UN, against the Human Rights Council, against the kumbaya of human rights, going around, the general notion that all this is just, that sovereignty and strength actually is what really matters. That, in my view, and in Europe's view, did for a while really threaten the credibility of those institutions. We can all discuss, and I think probably agree that many of the institutions need quite a bit of reform. But that's one thing, and throwing out the baby with the bathwater is another thing. And for us, as fundamental, countries that believe in that kind of open society that respects human dignity, we have to return back to defending those institutions as much as we can. Okay, the second point is that the European Union that I represent, you could call it an institution, there's 27 countries together, is anything but retreating from human rights or the promotion of them. In fact, I was privileged to be the first European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, a position created explicitly in 2012, and to do this until 2019 when I came as ambassador to this country. And I can tell you that we placed emphasis on many things. I'll mention one, and I'm sure the rest of the discussion will allow us to talk about other stuff. So, I went to some of the toughest countries in the world where democracy and human rights were really under challenge. And we had long discussions. And when virtually every other argument failed, at some point people will turn around to me and say, you know what, Mr. Lambrinidis, who are you to talk? Who are you to talk? Look at migration in Europe and violation of rights. Look at racism, xenophobia. Look at this government, what they're doing, the other government. Who are you to talk? Of course, they were not asking me in order to say, well, look, you have problems, we have problems, let's stick together and work together to fix them. They were basically saying it to say, look, I do bad things, you do bad things, leave me alone, I'll leave you alone, right? Now, quite aside from the fact that no one is perfect in human rights, and I will concede that, absolutely, that does not mean that therefore everyone is equally imperfect. Perfection in human rights is not the litmus test. And that's what I extensively discussed with my interlocutors. If that were the test, no one's perfect. The litmus test, in my view, is whether or not you have in your country those independent institutions that can ensure that you cannot shove your human rights violations under the carpet. In other words, no one is perfect, but are you trying to become more perfect, or are you trying to become worse? Do you have independent courts that are able to try a policeman that maybe abused a peaceful protester, and in fact even convince them, even if a particular government does not want that conviction to take place? Do you have, free and fair elections that allow then for free and fair parliaments to be in place, where you have all these different opinions, but people can stand up and say, you know what, I think this terrible violation is happening, my government is doing this terrible thing. Someone else can stand up and say, no, that's not the case. But at any rate, the government is forced to address the elected representatives' free views. Do you have a free press where, again, the possibility of revealing what a particular journalist thinks is a human rights violation is allowed without that person being thrown in jail or their life being threatened? Do you have an independent civil society that you may not agree with? Heck, look, when I was EU's of Human Rights, many NGOs came to my office every day, from the biggest to the smallest, from every country in the world. But I assure you, in most cases, they did not come to tell me what a great job I was doing. They came to tell me why I was messing things up. And you know what? I disagreed many times, and other times I went, maybe they have a point. The point is, my feet were kept on the coal because we allow for civil society to be free. Do you have free, independent universities? Do you have independent human rights institutions and bodies that follow? Okay? That is the test. If you are struggling to put those independent institutions in place, you can talk. So I took the conversation quite out of that general theoretical, and I took it down to the practical, which is what we're talking now, right? Institutions. My final point very quickly, I fully agree. I think with both of you, when you talked about trying to understand other countries in the world, we as Europeans, Americans, French, whatever nationality you are in this room, we have been focusing for too long on the bad guys, and we know who they are. They're the ones who are, in fact, ideologically or politically committed against democracy and rights. Or on the good guys, which is us, right? How do we cooperate together better? How do we coordinate better? And all that stuff. That's great. Except that ignores the fact that apart from the clear good guys and the clear bad guys, there are all these countries in the world somewhere in a gray zone sitting on the fence, not committed ideologically or politically against democracy or right, but trying to get there, doing it wrong, in some cases sliding back. That gray zones of countries is where this battle for democracy and human rights will be played out in the next few years. Stu, you mentioned diplomacy. That's a challenge. Absolutely, absolutely. And Rama went in a brilliant analysis of Africa, in my view. We have ignored those countries, and there are ways and narratives to approach them. I'll tell you one thing, and I close with this. Of course, in this country, or in Europe, when we talk about Russia's invasion, we do emphasize that their effort is to destroy freedom and democracy in Ukraine and in their general neighborhood. They do not like international law. They like to violate it, let alone in Russia itself. But the fact of the matter is that if I try to create a coalition of democracies against autocracies in the case of Russia, I bump into many of the issues that you have raised. What I can do is I can talk to countries around the world about the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, about the right of people to self-determination in their countries, the inviolability of borders, and I can talk to them about the revisionist might is right powers that are trying to trash this. And I can try to ask them if in their own countries and neighborhoods, if we got rid of those laws, international laws, would they feel safe? Or are there enough bullies around in the world to be able to threaten anyone's independence if they have a few more weapons or a few more money? And I bet you that there you would get an entirely different audience than what you do by simply asking people to be with you or against you.
Thank you. Do you want to add something on that? Or
Did you have a question? I was going to.
go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to echo both thoughts, which is a little bit of humility, inclusion, and the idea that our international institutions, while they must respond to a crisis, but they also have to deal with these systemic issues of inequality, of hope, of creating, I think, a pathway for these countries to see why these systems and institutions are in order. And I just wanted to make one point. We're talking about international institutions, and they're traditionally defined as, you know, whether it's the UN, the World Bank, NATO, WHO, and all this. But I think there's something else going on in the world, which is that people are demanding what they should of these institutions, but the capacity of these institutions to actually deal with these immense challenges can sometimes be overwhelming. But I think there's an interesting movement going on in the world where networks of leaders, whether it's academia, NGOs, business, labor, all of these organizations that have worked across borders for decades, which can't just sit on the sidelines and say that's the institution's problem. They have to figure out ways of creating coalitions around issues. And I'm reminded of, when speaking of Africa, of, you know, for all the rhetoric about the importance of Africa, I remember when I worked in the White House, it was PEPFAR and the diplomacy of deeds, of doing something intentional and working on priorities of the people that made a difference. And I think that's something which we need to be reminded of today if we want to convince people that our system and our values are worth fighting for.
Well, thanks all for putting a lot of wonderful thoughts up there. I wanted to ask a little bit, and picking up on Rama's points, or on all three, you know, if we think of the institutions that we have now and the historical context in which they were produced, right? So post-war, responding to the horrors of World War II, thinking about a way to kind of prevent something, right? To kind of have a different future. And in some ways, the EU and others are you know, it kind of emerged out of that goal, right? For Europe to no longer fall into warfare. And it's something that has been largely successful, although the current moment obviously threatens that in certain ways. But then, of course, also the big challenges that were ahead, which was decolonization, right? So, and when these institutions were created, you had essentially much of the world dominated by British and French power. So all the kinds of questions that Rama has put on the table. And it feels like one of the questions is, do the international institutions today, how deeply do they have to be reconfigured? You know, are we facing such a different world that maybe the institutions have to be rethought deeply? Or do you feel like the basic structures are in place and they have to be adapted? And what are the key crises that these international institutions have to deal with? It feels like both in terms of economic policy, humanitarianism, and so forth, all those are approaches that have been strongly criticized, and yet the problems keep mounting. So I just kind of wonder how you feel about whether there's a deep reinvention of institutions in order, or is it kind of tweaking and perfection? And maybe you all have slightly different answers to that. But
I'll be very brief. I think if you got rid of them to start new ones, you'd have a problem. I think you have to preserve them, reform them, make them more inclusive. We talked about the African voice, or Japan, which contributes a huge amount to the United Nations, other countries being members of the Security Council. I think reform, to me, would be the most pragmatic, but there has to be a reinvention of process, and there has to be a re-establishment of accountability, and a communications exercise to convince publics in our country and other countries why, whether you're talking about the pandemic or Ukraine, these are precious institutions. They're not perfect. Many of them are flawed. But I'm concerned that if we just did away with them and said we're going to start from scratch, it would be a very, very tall political task.
Thank you. Yeah, what do you all think, Rama?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, these organizations are so heavy, and it's a legacy of the past. There are mandates, tools, governance, so many aspects, dimensions we should take into consideration to be able to reform them. But the security, the UN and the heart of the UN has not been reformed since the first day, and we cannot take that as an excuse to stay there without doing anything, because in the meantime, the rest of the world is moving on, moving forward. Like I said, they have their own structures. There is a new energy order. Another word is parallel to our word. If I speak from Paris, can I? When I was representing France as ambassador to the UNESCO, it was the heart of culture of the UN system, influence then. I remember the Arab Spring. I was there representing France in this organization. And that was just crazy because while the regimes there tried to remain on their seats, the ambassadors, my colleagues in that organization, UNESCO, they just left one after another. Like on Monday, the ambassador of Tunisia, he resigned. The day after, the ambassador of another country resigned. Because culture is a powerful tool for change, which means that we are in a very critical moment between hard power and soft power. The noise of weapons is still there, obviously. But in the meantime, you have the tool of influence that are stronger, much stronger than ever. And that means that the nuclear strength is not the only tool of power today. We can mention so many examples. For example, the currency. The dollar is the first currency in the world, right? And in the meantime, you have something incredible that is going on right now, since many years now, digital currencies. And when you talk about digital currencies, you talk about mobile payments, mobile banking, digital infrastructure. It's something really important. And, Chinese, they know that the key of the trade, the international trade, it's the currency. It's the dollar. That's why they cannot say, well, we are the first economy in the world. So they have 2 decades to try to unseat the dollar. And what tool do they use? digital currencies, mobile payment, digital infrastructure, creative industries. And the African continent is one of the most important battleground of this. Another example, the Netflix. Netflix is a powerful tool of influence. And there is a growing African portfolio on Netflix. If you switch on Netflix, you will see that. Nollywood in Nigeria. In 2016, when Nigeria decided to include Nollywood in its GDP, Nigeria became the first economy in Africa, before South Africa. That means something too. I can take many examples like this to explain that even sports. I was Minister of Sports in France, and at that time, we have experienced this incredible moment of Olympic Games in China. It was very tough for me, who was handling human rights issues, but that moment was a demonstration of strength, geopolitical strength from Beijing, because they knew that sports means a lot on the geopolitical stage, and it was a tool of influence too. So many examples like this that should be included in this order of international organizations to appreciate if this country or this country should belong to the aristocratic order. That's something very important. So from time to time, we can mention a few names like Japan, but Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, India, to join this new order at the very top level, the G20, the BRICS, so many organizations that try to include them, but obviously it's not enough. And it's not only about a new power, it's about new alliances, because I think that from Paris to Washington, they need to develop these new alliances with these new countries who are in the global south and who represent a lot in terms of influence, in terms of, of new power. And like I said, it's innovation is there. We met in Dakar, in another debate like this, Les Ateliers de la Pensée, and these global souths were thinking how to renew the world. And that was really extraordinary to see all the ideas that come from there, and that should be very helpful to renew, what we call the new, the geopolitical order.
Thank you.
So I fully agree with Stu, 100%, nothing to add. Yes. Rama, you mentioned soft power and hard power, and I'm glad you did, because that was, again, when the European Union was going around the world promoting human rights, very often what I got from countries that were violating, the freedom of expression or the right to free assembly, was that, why is the EU, such a soft kumbaya power? I mean, here we are fighting terrorists. Here we are trying to protect our security. And you are coming in talking about human rights and free protests and all those things? Why? So I used to answer that question with another question, and my question to them was, okay, tell me what's so scary about smart girls? Why did Boko Haram in Nigeria abduct hundreds of girls from school instead of bombing one more police barracks they're good at? Why did the Taliban in Pakistan, plant a bullet in Malala's head when she was advocating girls' education? Why did ISIS in Iraq, abduct and forcefully marry and raped so many Yazidi girls? Why are the Taliban now in Pakistan trying to repress women and girls the way they are? And the answer to me was very obvious. Smart girls can become educated girls, and educated girls can become empowered women, and empowered women change dramatically any society, and the last thing a terrorist wants is empowered societies. They want societies with big black holes of power they can fill in with their hatred and with their violence. So you want to fight terrorists? Educate girls and boys. Educate. And I don't care if you're the UN or UNESCO or the EU, it doesn't take tremendous brilliance to figure out how to try to build education institutions and alliances in many countries around the world. In some instances, you would have difficulties. But when you look at those gray zone countries, perhaps not that many. And we're out there in the front lines doing this. Now, a second thing that I want to say on this, and about the health of our democracy. But let me just see, because I scribble things down, then I forget what I want to say. Okay, so guys, I don't care what international organization we had. I said this at the beginning. We have to understand that it is our credibility as America, as Europe, that in the end of the day will make those organizations strong or weak. If our credibility is undermined by us, we have a real issue. We cannot really convince anyone else. Our calling card in these discussions is our credibility. Now, a huge issue that the European Union today is legislating on has to do with, privacy. The internet, artificial intelligence, what it can gather for us, how we protect data, all those things. Now, that was so exotic a few years back when we were running this at the EU level back in the late 2000s. Now everyone kind of gets it. But again, I would go around the world and raise this issue, and many countries would come to me, repressive countries, of course, and say, look, we need all this information. Our police needs it. We have to catch the bad guys. Are you, what are you, Mr. Lambrinidis? Are you a terrorist? No. Are you an organized criminal? No. Then what's your problem? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. We're not after you. And I would tell them, you know what? If you have nothing to hide, you don't have a life. Get a life. We all have hundreds of perfectly legal, legitimate things to hide. You have nothing to hide, just give me your credit card number. If nothing to hide, tell me who you voted for in the last election. I know it's, you're not supposed to, but what the heck? I mean, there are arguments based on those fundamental elements of human dignity that if you present in a way that in whatever context works, resonate with people. Human dignity resonates with people, and mind you, in the UN Charter is the first thing up there, human dignity. It resonates with people. I am very optimistic in the end of the day, although I do see the problems on the avalanche, and I fully agree with you. The institutions, look, I'm not a big institution guy, although I represent a big institution. What I mean by this is, I actually want to get things done, and very often I get it done without really taking into account who I have to call in Brussels to maybe have someone else call in Brussels. I just get it done. I'd much rather ask for forgiveness than for permission, because very often you can't. So, and I think that in fact, both ourselves and our international institutions sometimes, you know, before they are reformed the perfect way, let's get some good people, you know, ask for forgiveness if they have to, but at least just go ahead and do things. We know what the challenges are.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I want to try to squeeze in one tiny short question and maybe some short answers before we move to the next panel. How about there in the yellow? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Just very quickly, I think it's sort of tempting to look at a structure today and say, you know, when it was created, the way it was created is still applicable. So if you look at the way the United States was created and the people in the room for, you know, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, it's an evolution. And it is time, of course, not out of just simply idealistic, it's the right thing to do, which it is, but also if the United States wants to get anything done in the world, or the EU, it has to view this global south as a partner, as an equal partner, and be willing to collaborate and be willing to kind of create a much better relationship, and not assume that just because the structure was designed in 1947, that that's the way it's going to work going forward. We have to really invest in that.
Great. Well, this has been fantastic. We'll pick up some of these themes in the next panel, which starts, well, which is supposed to start at 8:10. Maybe we'll start at 8:15. Is that okay, Vincent? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you all very much.
his conversation with Amanda and Gael on very, very specific topics. This is the way we designed this, this evening of conversations around democracy. First, having a global, more conceptual view on the revitalization of democracy, then going from the national to the global, and then insisting more on specific issues. And we're so privileged to have three academics with us, and also policymakers who are directly involved with very specific issues such as environmental justice and migrations, and obviously with a broader view of Laurent on revitalization of democracies. So.
Thank you, Vincent. Yes, I'm in a peculiar position here, kind of a double consciousness where I have to, although we're all familiar with moderators who sometimes talk too much in the moderating, so I'm just going to allow myself to fulfill that role tonight. But really, we have, with the two of you, sort of so much to discuss. I'm going to just briefly introduce Gael Giraud, who has a remarkable background, priest, economist, works on environment, is currently a research professor at Georgetown University, where he's founded the Georgetown Environmental Justice Program. Then Amanda Frost, who's Bronfman Distinguished Professor of Law and Government at American University, works on constitutionalism, immigration, and has just published a book called You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to Dreamers, which is a remarkable book. I encourage you to look up. So we've decided that we're going to try to talk a bit about hope and what gives us a kind of sense of hope for the future, and where kind of the resources might come for positive change. What you see as kind of positive spaces of possibility, of revitalizing a sense of the common good and commons. And I'm going to start with you, Amanda, to talk a little bit about immigration and where you see that, how you take that question.
Yes, and thank you, Laurent, for your role tonight, and thanks so much for inviting me here. I have to say I'm a 25-year resident of the District of Columbia, so it's such a pleasure to be here with Secretary Bassett. And I spent 2 years as an immigrant in France, just returning less than a year ago. So I also feel a real affinity with France, and so I'm delighted to be here. I see a lot of hope with immigration, and it's funny because when my students think about taking immigration law, a few of them, which I teach, a few of them say, oh, I think it would be such a depressing class. And I say not at all. So immigration is a driver of elections, and it's a highly contentious issue in both the United States and France. And while I don't think it should be contentious or contested for all the reasons that it often is, I do think immigration is so vital and important and something that we deserve to think deserves a lot of thought and attention in our political system. And I'll just throw out a couple of numbers that at least surprised me when I first saw them and thought about them, a couple of statistics. So the United States, actually like France, is about 14% foreign-born today. And that number varies over time, but that's close to the highest it's ever been. It was that number in the early part of the 20th century, which was also a time of great contestation over immigration, and we had lots of national debates about it. So that number is important, but I also think related is the important number, which is of all the people who were born in the US, 11% of those people, their parents were immigrants. So if you add up all those numbers, you've got about a quarter of the population of the United States that is created directly by our immigration laws and laws of the recent past. So of course those are going to be very important when we think about the future of our country, and we should be giving those a lot of thought. But the final point I'll make here, in addition to the fact that immigration is such an important part of deciding who we are going to become as a country, when we set those laws, we're thinking about that future for ourselves and our children and our children's children, is the fact that we desperately need immigrants. If there was a bill that did not pass the Senate, but it passed the House about a year ago, that would have granted legal status to the Dreamers, the group of young people that were brought to the United States by their parents without lawful status and who've stayed in the United States and live here and are American in all ways other than legally. But that bill also would have given lawful status to the undocumented farm workers. And here's another key point, another key fact. Half of the people that harvest the crops in the United States are undocumented. So half the people that bring us our food don't have legal status. That's a problem that the United States needs to resolve by welcoming in those people and by giving them legal status. And as I said, the bill passed the House, but not the Senate, so we're still working on that. But in terms of being hopeful, I think immigrants are the future because, of course, the United States is not replicating itself. When we look at births, it's below the 2.1 replacement rate, as is the case, by the way, for France and most of Europe, all of Europe. So immigrants are where we need to turn for our future, and for that reason, I am hopeful, and I think it's an issue that deserves our nation's attention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Maybe I say a few words on immigration, and then I try to answer also your question. On immigration, I would say two things. First, also it's a sign of hope for me, because as you know, the unique continent in the coming decades, which will experience a demographic push, is actually Africa. Africa today, it's 1.3 billion people, and there might be something between 800 million or 1.5 billion more people in one generation, which no continent has ever experienced in the past. That's big, that's gigantic. And at the same time, a number of countries, essentially in Europe, are aging. So from a purely abstract viewpoint, there is a win-win strategy to be put into practice here, which is that Europe, if Europe was clever enough, especially France, should welcome part of these people so that they could work in Europe. There is one country which is doing this very successfully for 2 decades now, it's Japan. Japan has implemented a very successful policy of welcoming many people, essentially from Southeast Asia, but now they tried also to have people from Africa who are going to work in Japan, so they go to university, they get funding from the state, and then they stay in Japan to work in Japan. And that's also a solution for the big problem of how you fund pensions in a society of elderly people. So that's my hope regarding immigration. Now, there is another aspect on which we are working at Georgetown University at the Environmental Justice Program, which is the link between climate change and immigration. And there are a number of blind spots, I believe, that we should really pinpoint. One of them being Indonesia, of which nobody thinks in terms of migration. Why? Because Indonesia, you know, it's the biggest Muslim country in the world today. 270 million people, probably 300 million in a few years. And at the same time, Indonesia will be one of the places where you will have peaks of heat and humidity virtually every day at the end of the century if we still follow the same, you know, business as usual scenario in terms of climate change, which means people will have to migrate just to survive. Indonesia will also lack access to drinkable water. Indonesia is threatened by the rise of the sea level. You know that Jakarta is no longer the capital city of Indonesia because of the rise of the sea level. Indonesia is exposed to big typhoons from the Pacific Ocean, to seismic activity, volcanic activity, etc., etc. And then the big question is, where are these people going to migrate? Is it Australia? Is it Vietnam, Malaysia, which is essentially the backyard of China? Big, big geopolitical question. And now to come back to your initial question, which is what are the signs of hope? I do believe that the pandemic, it might sound paradoxical, but the coronavirus pandemic is a sign of hope insofar it has helped us understand that there are a number of global commons on which we should really, take care of. WHO did not succeed because nobody was listening to WHO. There was not the real cooperation among states, or so few cooperation. It's not successful, to say the least. And at the same time, we all made the experience that the health of a family in Wuhan, China, matters for everybody. So health is a common good, a global common good, and we don't have the institutions to take care of that. So there is one institution in Switzerland which I believe shows the direction in which we should work, and we were talking in the first panel about reforming global institutions, and I think that's one direction. So this institution in Switzerland is called DNDi, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which is a very weird hybrid organization where you have around the table both people from the private sector, sovereign states, and NGOs from the civil society. What do? They try to provide therapies against diseases which are neglected by the private sector because people who are suffering from this disease are too poor to pay anything. One example is the hepatitis C in Egypt. So DNDi succeeds in providing a therapy against hepatitis C for approximately $300, while a therapy against this disease in Europe costs at least 4,000 euros. So it's a big success. So it's, even though it's not free of charge, you have to pay something, but the price has nothing to do with the price you would pay in Europe. Why? Because there is this collaboration among actors which usually compete against each other instead of collaborating with each other, which means they treat health not as a private good, because you don't have just a private sector, big pharma, not as a public good, because you don't have just sovereign states, but you do have the civil society, NGOs, private sector, and the state collaborating in order to treat it as a global commons and to try to fight against the blind spots in health. And I believe what we should have learned, or one of the lessons we should draw from the pandemic, is that we should try to scale up these kind of institutions to address not just these particular diseases, but health as such, as a global commons. And once you start with health, you can think also, of course, of biodiversity, of the atmosphere, of the deep oceans, of space. So the French embassy here in Washington gave to us in Georgetown University a beautiful talk a few days ago about space and the way space now is going to be privatized. Do we really want space to be privatized? Or do we want to consider space as a global commons? Space will never become a public good because there is fortunately no super public state for which we would have a bureaucracy taking care of space. So it must be a commons. What are the institutions, the hybrid institutions, neither purely private nor purely public, which could take care of space?
Thank you both. I feel like in this conversation and the earlier one too, we're also trying to think about what the reconfiguration of where we think the democratic spaces are exactly, right? So on the one hand, a certain vision of democracy which traces its history primarily through a kind of European history or North American history. But at the same time, we're talking about these kind of global flows and the possibilities for democracy that are emerging in sort of African context or in a lot of other contexts. And it seems like part of the challenge of the moment is to figure out how we think about democracy truly globally. Immigration seems like one space to think about that because, of course, one of the things that immigration brings is a variety of experiences, historical experiences, cultures that can infuse a new society with different ideas of practices. I think around environment, it's clear that many of these deeply affected places like Africa are developing responses, or maybe have long had responses to thinking about biodiversity, et cetera. So I guess I'd pose to both of you is one of the reasons for hope maybe that we're seeing from all kinds of different spaces, perhaps solutions emerging from maybe unexpected places. And how does that work? How might that help us renew our conversations and our institutions? Again, I'm thinking of the prior panel and Rama's thinking about how do we really think about Africa infusing our sense of these institutions. I know that's a large question, but maybe are there, if that touches on some of the questions you'd like to raise.
Well, one point I want to make that responds to the first part of what you just said, and also I think connects up with actually the first panel as well, is if you look back at the history of our reaction to immigration in the United States, it's actually, it's heartening. It actually makes I sort of suggest it if you're feeling some despair. Because one, things have been worse, and that's helpful to know. But also, you can see patterns repeat themselves with levels of fear around certain issues that you can see that in perspective today. So if you look back at the history of immigration in the United States, there was a few things that were repeatedly said about each group that was coming in, whether it be Chinese, Japanese, Irish, Italian. I'm sure this isn't news to this room, but people said a whole bunch of things, and some of them went to that point about democracy. They said, these people will never assimilate, they won't learn English, but also they don't understand and by nature can't be part of a democratic country. They're undemocratic. And then a sort of tail point that I think doesn't get enough attention in the literature about immigrants is there was great fear of what they would do when they got the power to vote. Like they'll be tribal in their voting and they will, this is often very racist, right? So they'll just vote against white interests and for their interests. So, of course, we know the end of that story when we look at the groups that we're talking about back in the turn of the 20th century, the Chinese, the Japanese, Italians, Irish, which is, of course, everyone was capable of assimilating or integrating, especially once they weren't forced to live in ethnic enclaves and live in a segregated lifestyle. Second, of course, everyone learned English to the point where now English is spoken throughout the entire world. But everybody, of course, could be part of a democratic system, and people didn't vote tribally. I mean, I think that's really interesting to look at today. Today, 10% of the people who cast their votes in the last election were naturalized citizens, foreign-born who were naturalized to become Americans. They're 10% of the vote, and they did not vote as a monolithic bloc. So to the degree that there's fear around immigrants and our democratic process and system and fear of the other, the history shows quite the opposite.
I guess one way to answer your question would be to go back to the very definition of democracy, actually, mixing both the European history and the North American history. And I would say also of modernity. I mean, someone in the first panel mentioned a beautiful book by Pankaj Mishra, The Age of Anger, and I do believe this is one way to understand the question. I would say, modernity in the Western sense of the word means three things. There are three pillars to it. One of them is first the fact that we French, we have cut the head of the king, which means, in other words, 1 century after the Brits, it's true, but which means essentially we were saying, and Europe was saying, and North America, the US was saying at the same time, it's no longer the church, no longer the history or the tradition which is going to decide for us what we have to do. But we are going to decide this democratically. So the locus of power is empty, it's no longer the body of the king, but we are going to fill it, with our decisions, the deliberation, and that's actually the quintessence of democracy. First pillar. Second pillar, the rule of law, in order to protect the citizen from, the dictatorship of the state. So the first pillar essentially says it's one way to say freedom in front of, faith, religion, tradition, etc. The second pillar is equality in front of the law. And the third pillar back then in the 18th century was private ownership, which already in the declarations of the late 18th century was considered as sacred and inviolable. And you find this again in 1948 in the Universal Declaration. And I guess the hope back then of this quote-unquote bourgeois revolution was to say, the first and the second pillar provide the skeleton of modernity and private ownership will provide the flesh, within the society. And now it seems to me what Pankaj Mishra is saying and the experience that we're making due to the incredible rise of inequality and climate change is that the third pillar is no longer working. And we make this experience. Why? First, because let's say, if someone in the US is the owner of a garden where you have oil beneath the surface, that someone is allowed to extract the oil and destroy the climate. Why? Because by being the owner of the garden, he or she is also the owner of the oil beneath the surface. So private ownership should have boundaries. That is, you should be able to do whatever you want with your ownership, provided you don't destroy a number of global commons. And who is going to decide this? So here we have to reform completely one of the basic stones, I believe, of modernity, which is private ownership. Another aspect linked to the first and the second pillar is also the sovereignty of the state. Think of what's happening today in Brazil, when President Bolsonaro refuses to take care of the Amazon. He's destroying one of the big global commons of the planet, and he's threatening billions of people in the coming decades. But who within the international community has a right to tell him, hey, you should take care of the Amazon, because Brazil is a sovereign state. So even the sovereignty of the state that we experience since, let's say, the Westphalian, treaties, has to be put into question and needs to have boundaries. That is, the state can do whatever it wants democratically, provided it does not violate or destroy a number of global commons. And again, same question, who is going to put these boundaries and to make sure they are satisfied, you see? And I guess the third aspect of the reform is that we have to replace the private ownership as being, the mantra to provide flesh to the skeleton of modernity by commons. That is, we are making the experience that private ownership is not part of the solution, but is partially part of the problem. We have to put boundaries to it and to replace it by the commons, global commons, for which we need to build the right institutions.
So in terms of the scale of action, and so I'm thinking of something that Sophia brought up at the end of our conversation, but where do you see the scales, right? I think for sort of challenging, for instance, we know, I think your call for the positives of immigration, but we obviously are facing so much hostility or kind of political parties and others who kind of see immigration as a threat. And in your case, right, I think around environment, for instance, you know, so many powerful forces that seem to not, to refuse this idea, right, that there's a kind of responsibility. So I wonder as people, as citizens are thinking what scale to work on, and especially what scale to work on for these international problems, right? Is there a way to work locally that is also global, or I just wonder how you would think about that. What are the places and scales that people can have the most impact, and how do we kind of think through that in the future? Because it does feel like to me that the democratic, I mean, at the end of the day, the only possibility for enforcing this will be some kind of democratic accountability that comes from a kind of popular voice. And yet those voices, I think, constantly feel excluded in various ways. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yes, and actually immigration is really interesting in that it's an issue that is supposedly and supposed to be controlled at the federal level, but there's lots of state initiatives related to immigration that are constantly going forward today, depending on who's president. Different states take the lead. But you may have heard the term sanctuary city, which I don't love as a term because I think it can be misleading. But the idea is cities like Chicago or San Francisco say we are not going to assist in immigration enforcement. They can't stand as a bar to it. The rule of law would prevent that and the federal authority there. But they can say we won't cooperate with immigration officials or assist in that. Or you could have local groups, like actually one that I volunteer for, who help welcome refugees from Afghanistan or Ukraine and help set them up in their homes and sponsor them and help their children figure out which schools to enroll in. Being a recent immigrant myself to a country where I didn't speak the language perfectly, I know the great value of having people welcome and help the immigrant integrate into the country. And that's another way in which at the local level you can make a difference. And in addition, of course, to electing not just federal officials, but also state and local officials who will have welcoming policies. And the third point I'll make, just because I think we forget it, and I view it as a bright spot in the recent years, I think the last 5, 6, 7 years in the United States, I feel like in some ways we're seeing the worst of our country, and the worst is being brought out in the sort of characteristics that I think of as the United States. He agrees with me. Thanks. But there was a moment that I thought was fascinating in the middle of all this. In 2018, the Trump administration put in place family separation. You may remember there was a he's upset. There was a zero tolerance policy, and children were being taken away from their parents at the border. And what's interesting is that the American people didn't stand for that. There was protests, there was extraordinary outcry and criticism, even by those who were very anti, any sort of fluidity in the border and very anti-immigrant. They said, this is wrong, right? And everyone could relate to the feeling of a child being taken from a parent. Many people are parents, everyone's been a child. And I thought our common humanity that was a good moment to both exhibit in humanity. That was something you could do, was protest that. And we did as a nation and rejected that policy.
On this question of migration, I would maybe add one point, which is the fact that we have also run simulations in our program suggesting that still if we don't do anything against climate change, which hopefully will not happen, then even in the US there might be a number of problems. That is, the southeastern coast of the US would experience every third day peaks of heat and humidity which are lethal for a normal human body, which means probably there will be huge migrations inside the US, not just from Mexico to the US or Latin America to the US, but also inside the US. And most of these people obviously will go to the north. Same story for China. So the eastern coast of China will become hardly habitable by people, and people will not be able to rely on air conditioning to save themselves, because we know that air conditioning is part of the problem, not of the solution. So there is also this aspect. I mean, the way we learn today to host refugees coming from Latin America, especially in the US, or from Africa and Europe, is a preliminary of showing something about the way we are going to host migrations inside the country in the future decades. Now, to try to come back to your question on where could we act and have an impact, it will probably surprise you, but I do believe on the financial systems. And it's surprising that nobody spoke about the financial system so far, both for environment and democracy. So the most obvious is environment. Last year, we published a report about the Eurozone. So it's not the US, but we are trying to do the same job for the US, asking the following questions about the first 11 big banks in the Eurozone. what is the amount of assets that they have on the balance sheet which are directly linked to fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas? And the answer is 530 billion euros, which might not look as a gigantic amount of money, but which represents on average 95% of the equity of each of these banks. 95%. And when a bank has lost 95% of its equity, it's just bankrupt, as you know. In other words, the bankers know perfectly that if tomorrow morning we were bold enough to say we decide that both coal, oil, and gas are stranded assets whose market value is going to plunge to zero in the coming weeks, then all these banks will be bankrupt. They know it. I ask the questions to most of these bankers, and they're not stupid, they know it. And so they are forced to do greenwashing. So with the left hand, they claim, well, you know, we have converted to ecology in 2009, and now we are promoting green bonds and all these kind of questions. But with the right hand, they are just breaking like crazy to make it happen as slowly as possible. And the first guy who said it publicly was Mark Carney, the famous governor of the Central Bank of England, the Bank of England. In 2015, in his famous speech, talk to Deloitte, you know, September 2015, where he spoke about the transition risk, which is an euphemism to say, if we go too quickly, the financial institutions will go bankrupt because they rely so heavily on fossil fuel assets that they cannot just get rid of them. So I think this is one big question, because as long as banks will essentially be again the ecological transition just for their own survival, we won't make any progress. And I also believe this is a question for democracy. If we want to revitalize democracy, we do have to do something in order to regulate financial markets. Why? For the very simple following reason, which is that a financial market cannot work as a democracy. It's not. What is the main difference? The main difference is that when you vote in a country, even if the guy for whom you voted is not elected, nobody is going to kill you because nobody knows for whom you voted. So the secrecy and the anonymity of the vote is crucial. On a financial market, this does not exist. Everybody knows whether you voted for this stock or this bond. And if you are wrong insofar you don't believe what the market believes, you will be punished by the market. Namely, you will lose money. So you are forced to just anticipate what the market believes to be true, because that, at the end of the day, will be the truth. You can't have your own opinion, and you cannot vote freely. In other words, financial markets is exactly the opposite of a democracy. Now, if you decide, as we did in the Eurozone, and as it's also the case in the US, that a country, in order to fund its public policy, needs to rely on borrowing money on financial markets, what are you saying? Are you saying, actually, at the end of the day, those who are going to decide whether your public policy is sound or not, these are financial markets, which are not democratic. And we hear this in Europe, and I'm sure we also hear this in the US. Some people saying, what's the use of voting while actually Wall Street is deciding our policy? You know? So there is a question here just to free the state from the diktat of financial markets. And that's easy. You could say, well, in order to fund a public policy, you rely on your central bank, which can create money for free. The Fed can create money. The Fed has created billions, as you know, in order to save banks. Why would not the Fed create billions to fund public policy, like, you know, the Rebuild Better program of the Biden administration, or a Green New Deal in the Eurozone? You know, this would be a way also to say we believe in democracy, and financial markets are not the last word of democracy.
Well, I think I'll open it up for questions, and we probably have a lot of stacked questions from the whole evening, although it's maybe unfair for us to have to answer them. But happy to take a few more questions and or thoughts about some of the questions. We'll see whether, yeah, go ahead.
Professor, my name is Samson Jarso. I'm a Georgetown graduate, but I also teach a course in global health engineering. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about global health security as a global common, as opposed to a private good or public good.
Sure, I can say a few words on that. So why is it impossible to deal with global health as a private good? Let's take the example of the vaccine. If you sell the vaccine and you ask people to pay something to get vaccinated, there will be poor people who won't be able to get vaccinated. those people who will not be vaccinated, they will get the virus and they will contaminate you. That's exactly the problem that China is facing today. So you cannot privatize health. It's just the best way not to take care of health. Now, fortunately, we don't have a big worldwide state which could treat health as a public good. You know, there is a kind of, actually there's a misunderstanding in the world of global public goods at the beginning of the 2000s that was put, in the agenda by the World Bank, because this would mean, from the viewpoint of an economist, that there would be a state taking care of that. Fortunately, this state does not exist. It's not the US, it's not China. So we need something else, a hybrid institution which takes care of health in a different way. And I do believe what DNDi is doing is a very promising avenue of exploration. I'm not saying I have the solution, but I'm just saying this is one tentative which might be very inspiring in order to reform WHO so that for the next pandemic it will be much more efficient, hopefully. You know?
If Europe wants to stop saying no to Russia, what is the best approach Europe can have to solve the energy crisis? What do you think will be the best solution?
Oh,
I'm sorry. I have forgotten this, that I needed to repeat the question for the live stream. Sorry. I'll repeat it, yeah.
He will do it. He will repeat your question.
Yeah, sorry. So that, because I have a microphone, that's the difference. So the question is about how Europe can kind of deal with not consuming Russian oil. What are the options for doing that? So.
Russian oil and Russian gas, big question. So as you know, Germany and Italy especially are struggling with that. They rely a lot on this. So unfortunately, probably Germany is going to rely on coal, which is a very bad idea in terms of environment. But there is an alternative to that, and I'm very surprised. I know some people are starting speaking about it, which is Algerian gas. So Algeria has a lot of gas. Gas is much less polluting than oil. So it's better to use gas than oil. I'm not saying that's the ultimate solution, but it happens that we the French, we promised to Algeria that we would purchase their gas, and finally we decided to purchase Russian gas for a reason I don't understand. It's time now to purchase the Algerian gas. And of course, at the same time, we should accelerate the transition towards renewable energies, for sure.
Okay, so with the new agendas for global health and the crisis that came abroad with the pandemic and everything else like that, how far out do you think we are to resolve that with all the corruption and all of the capitalist issues that we have with everything ingrained for fossil fuels and for the opposite of the health of the planet as well as personal health?
Mm-hmm. So the question there is, dealing with all the crises that have unfolded, how close are we to really resolving them, given the kind of issues of corruption and? So, sort of, yeah. How long will it take? Are we in sight for a younger generation to sort of see these solutions? What's the time frame, I guess, is the question.
We're hoping people like you save us. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so, sorry.
No, please continue.
I think democracy is a great place to start, but it has issues just like all other systems do. And we still have immigration issues in America, even though the majority of people are immigrants. We all immigrated to America to create America. So, I know we can't agree on everything, but we do have to have a starting point for the next generation to agree that, this is the better way based off of what we've already seen history repeating itself with the pandemics, with the wars, and with the conflict in general.
Yeah, so I think the bigger question is sort of how does a generation now that's inherited all these things sort of, I guess, restart democracy, but also how do we deal with all that's been inherited and the heaviness of that?
So first of all, my apologies for my generation and older people. But the second point, and Gael, I think it's better to speak on this, but just to repeat some of what he said, and some of what the earlier panel said as well, talking about the problems of combining of democracy and capitalism. And we've never had, or if we've had, it's been a really bad idea, unregulated capitalism. And I think it's partly just we need to regulate our capitalism differently. So everything Gael said about the fact that there's such an incentive to keep burning coal and oil and keep destroying our planet, we have to change that, and we can. That doesn't mean getting rid of democracy. It means, one, educating people and investing in the public schools, and my kids are in the DC public schools, which are excellent, but every parent and every kid needs to be working to make those institutions as good as they can be, because that's where the future lies. But also changing the laws and rules so that it isn't the case that you make money by destroying the planet, right? It seems obvious, but that's how to change the incentives for today. So easy for me to say, so hard to do. But Gael will have a more maybe nuanced approach there. But
No, I would say definitely you have to do it. We have to do it together. And we don't have a second generation for that. So it's your generation and us. We are going to do the job, I'm sure. We can't wait for the next generation. I'm sorry for that. But that's pretty good for you. You know, you are a historical generation. No human generation had such a challenge in front of it. Now, to try to answer and to give some hope in this whole story, I do believe that actually all these questions boil down to the same problem, fortunately. Why? Because there is a strong relationship between the kind of energy regime you have in a society and the kind of political regime you have in the same society. One guy who put this very clearly is Timothy Mitchell, an American historian. He has written a beautiful book whose title is Carbon Democracy. And the main idea is to say, you know, in the 19th century, during the first part of the Industrial Revolution, essentially the UK and then slowly the US and the rest of Europe were relying on carbon. And it happens that coal is very hard to move, it's not easy, it's dirty, etc., which brings a lot of bargaining power to the workers. And most of the social, progresses that were made during the 19th century were probably made thanks to this. While now, if you shift to an oil-based society, it's completely different because oil is very easy to move. And that's why we had this kind of conservative revolution in the 70s, 80s of the last century, because then we had turned into a completely oil-based society on top of coal and gas. And there, of course, this gives a lot of bargaining power, not to the workers, but to the employers, let's say, roughly speaking. Then the big question is, what will be the democratic or political regime of a society based on renewable energies? Will it be closer to the coal democracy or to the oil democracy or non-democracy? You see, that's a big question. So a number of ecologists or ecological activists dream of a society which is entirely based on commons, let's say, roughly speaking, with the participative democracy, and everybody is producing energy in his own garden, thanks to some wind farm or these kind of things. And I have some doubt on this because you were using the word of tribalism 10 minutes ago, and I do believe if there is no state to make sure that the rule of law is enforced, then commons turn into tribal goods. Because people need solidarity, and there is violence, etc., etc. So you need a rule of law, and for that purpose you need a state. But a state can also be a very good vehicle in order to transition towards a renewable energy-based society. And so far, you may have a state, a very authoritarian state, coupled with a capitalist system, and that's China. Why? Because it happens that the fraction of the cost of producing energy with renewable energies, the fraction that is dedicated to the capex, that is capital investment, is much higher for renewable energies than for fossil fuels. That's essentially the idea of Jeremy Rifkin, when he speaks about the zero marginal cost society. So it's not completely zero, but it's very low, which means the cost of the initial investment in capital is very high, you see? Which means you give a lot of power to the quote-unquote capitalists, those who hold the financial money to fund an investment. So you may have, unfortunately, an option which might be viable from a purely economic viewpoint, where we would transition towards a society based on renewable energies with a completely anti-democratic state coupled with a private capitalist system, which is essentially what China is doing. And it might be the case that Europe, is kind of hesitating in which direction should we move? Towards a society based on commons, maybe with a welfare state, or a society with a strong anti-democratic state, a lot of yellow vests protesting, but then they get killed by the police, and this state coupled with, a private sector which is very strong. So we have these two options, and of course, probably the truth is somewhere in between. We need a state to enforce the rule of law and a lot of commons in the civil society. This is what I believe. But you see, by fostering democracy, we are also having an impact on the energy regime. By changing the energy regime, we have an impact on our political regime.
Mm-hmm.
We have the capabilities for it, and we have the platforms to talk about it, and we have the resources to do it, but we just don't have the camaraderie or the contributions from everybody involved to benefit the planet as a whole overnight. There's so much money and politics involved that we still have our conflicts with one another.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't look somebody in the face with a pure agenda to benefit one another without saying how much am I benefiting from my
Right. So kind of, yeah, it even returns to that. I think you're making a call for kind of returning to solidarity of a certain kind, but obviously that challenge is so high. Yeah. I think we'll take one more question here and then wrap up. That sounds right, Vincent, right? Yeah. Thank you. So the point is mainly that you're saying that values, you feel like there's been a loss of certain kinds of values and that we need to focus on that, the kind of individualism. And the question is sort of how do we return to some of those kind of system of values for democracy. So this will probably be the last things to say, so on that point.
Yeah, yes, and I'm maybe by nature optimistic, but I feel somewhat hopeful. I mean, we could look at the pandemic as a moment where at times we obviously failed, but at other times we rose to the occasion. We came up with a vaccine. Remember the first couple weeks? People said it couldn't be done within 4 or 5 years. It was done, right? Most people, granted on a nation-by-nation basis with some nations left out, but most people in the United States got vaccinated, right? Even despite all our contention about that. People wore masks for the most part at the worst moments, right? We could debate mask wearing, and we often do. But I guess you could take a positive view. You could say we did at least somewhat rise to the occasion with some gaps. So the question you had, which I think is similar to the point there, how do we create that sense of we're all in this together? I'd say education, a sense of hope, because if you feel despair, you tune out, which the first panel was saying, that's always a huge loss. So education, which I already mentioned, hope, and the third thing I'll say, which I haven't mentioned, is proximity. Stay close to the groups and the people that aren't just exactly like you, that have interests and issues that maybe relate to yours, but you haven't given their perspective enough thought. And I see proximity making a huge difference in my lifetime on one issue, same-sex marriage. The more people got to know that their family members were gay, the more they were willing to accept something that they had not tolerated. When I was young, it was shameful. By the time the Supreme Court ruled, the vast majority of Americans were fine with it. That was because of, I think, proximity. Your friend and neighbor was not any longer someone to be feared, but was someone just like you, and that helped change on that issue, and I think we can change going forward.
Thank you.
I think, yeah. I believe there was something very interesting in what you said, which is namely, the problem is not individualism, but the fact that people rely on the community. You said something like that. So my community, and this is something that strikes me as a French, and I'm here since 1 year only, that many people in the US, they rely on the community, be it the religious community, my district, the people with whom I work, etc. So it's not so much individualism in the sense of the individual, that's more, it seems to me, a rhetoric aspect, but the socialization is based on a community, much more than in France, for instance, I believe. So, and my impression is that these points to what we were trying to say earlier, which is namely, you know, if you think of a partition of the social space, so there are private goods, and that's the job of the market to take care of them. There are public goods, that's the job of the state, obviously. There are commons, that's the job of the civil society in collaboration with the private sector and the public sector, and there are tribal goods. And it seems to me when the social bound is threatened, when people are suffering too much, then they rely on the tribe. This is essentially what I guess Isabel Wilkerson, you know, in her beautiful book, Caste, is trying to say. One of the problems of racism is caste. A racist society is a society which is still based on caste, on tribes. And this was the case for the German Third Reich. This is still the case for India, and maybe it's partially also the case for the US. So I would say the main question is how to prevent a social body from just, you know, from the temptation of relying on my tribe. And for that purpose, you need just, I mean, quote unquote, to do what you just said, and also to make clear that it is in everybody's interest not to just rely on my tribe and my caste and my community, but also to be open to the others. The virus is the best example of that, you know, it seems to me.
Well, thank you. So a huge thank you to all of you for coming, to Vincent and the French Embassy, to the library for hosting us, and for continuing this conversation and making democracy thrive. So thank you.